Thanks. Is it working? Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much for having me. Let me get my clicker. Let's start. So, Decolonize your jam. I'm going to start with a disclaimer. In case you came here for a talk on like how to remove or to kind of improve the supply chain and decolonize it for actual jam, I have to disappoint you. So it's a very cool topic, I think next time, but of course it's actually about video games, about making games and how to think out of the box and kind of get away from some of these pre-constructed biases that we have as members of societies. So, I'm Allan, I'm Italian-Ghanaian, I'm founder at a game development company called Twin Drums. That's some of us, you can see, it's a very lovely crowd. We're based mostly in Berlin, but actually are all over the world. I am, full disclosure, based in winter in West Africa, and I come here in Europe for the rest of the year. I'm like a migratory bird. I just came from Ghana, I'm very cold, so if I'm shaking, it's just because of that. It's not, I'm not upset or anything. Yeah, this is the game we're working on, just for context. It's called the Ouagadougou Chronicles. It's a sandbox MMORPG where you can do like lots of life skills like farming, fishing, and so on, but it's non-violent. And also building villages with friends. And it's African-inspired, which of course is quite different from all the other games in the genre. So, today's topic. We're going to be talking about society and politics. And I'm going to say this disclaimer because I know there's still people out there in our industry saying that games and politics, they don't have anything to do with each other. And of course, that's ridiculous. So if you're here, I hope you agree. There was also a very great talk by Anita yesterday, Anita Sarkeesian. Yes, I know some of you are nodding, we're there. And it's kind of, I think, an interesting follow-up to today's conversation. Another disclaimer, a more serious one now, before we start. I come into this talk with an assumption. And the assumption is that the world in which we live is broken. The economy, the wealth gap, gender gap, like this list could go on, is terrible, it shouldn't be this way, and it also affects us game developers, the way we see the world, our unconscious biases, and by us I say myself, like everybody. So hopefully you agree with this. If you do, there's like content for you. If you don't agree and you think that everything is perfect and this world is perfect as it is, then we have a problem. No, then we just, basically we disagree on this. Colonialism is at the center of this talk. So briefly, you probably heard about it. It's when countries go to other parts of the world to take over, take the resources, exploit them, literally take the people as well as resources and move them around, kill them. It has happened for centuries. It's not fully gone. Many speak about neocolonialism, and if you look at the world and the state in which we are, it's hard to feel that it's completely gone and that we still don't have a system of exploitation going on between countries. And I think what's really interesting for what we're going to talk about in games today is how this way of thinking, this process, actually is very much about growth. The idea that you have to grow all the time. As a country, as an economy, even as an individual, you have to keep on accumulating, growing, becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, that means at some point taking over other countries, other people, and so on. And this philosophy of constant growth is still there. If you think about it, also capitalism, which is currently our dominant kind of social economic philosophy, is very much about growing non-stop. Like we look at GDPs and it's like if they don't grow, it's bad. The GDP, it doesn't need to shrink, even just stall, terrible. GDP is not growing, like we have to grow. And so the things are related, and I'm going to sometimes just like interchangeably talk about neocolonialism, colonialism, capitalism as one system, as one way of thinking. This is a kind of interesting example just to warm up. Not everything has to be growth and colonialism, but I think this is an interesting example of how things can suddenly become that. So Japan used to be like a very inward-looking country, sort of feudal. Now I'm not going to defend feudalism, pros and cons, but they were not invading other countries, they were just doing their own thing. And then I'm simplifying history now, but the Americans got there with the big ships. You should open your country, or eventually you will get invaded as well, like we did with the Philippines or Vietnam. the Japanese got scared and said, oh no, we should learn from these people and actually protect ourselves. Less than a century later, Japan went from isolationist country to colonizer, taking over half of Asia, kind of destroying lots of lives. The Chinese and the Koreans are still very upset about what they did. But I think this is an interesting example of how this philosophy is like very, can be quickly embraced and how powerful it is. You can go from an inward, kind of quiet country, isolated country, to a colonizer that takes over half of the continent and causes a lot of damage. So, games. I'm going to start talking about, actually the core topic. I think it's interesting when thinking about game development. So, as part of the jam, I guess you'll be thinking about this very soon, that there's various elements, mechanics, visual, music, themes. And I feel like thinking out of the colonial capitalistic box can help with all of these. So let's start with examples. So this is actually one of my favorite games, Civilization 6 specifically. Has any of you played this game before? Oh, nice. Hi, Civ people. So, great game, and I love it. And by the way, I'm going to criticize things that I also enjoy. That's fine. Like, I think we should do that. We shouldn't just acritically enjoy, things without, calling out what doesn't work. So great game, great design. But if you think about it, it's very much about exploitation. It's about growing, occupying more territory. And most victory conditions are about taking over, literally destroying everyone else and taking over everyone else, or like taking over everyone's culture, or like converting everyone to your own religion. So it's very much a philosophy of exploitation and expansion and colonialism, right? So it is a good game, yes. Is it really making an effort to kind of provide a different point of view or a different perspective on our broken world? Not really. So I think this is an interesting example of how maybe we can try thinking about different approaches. And out there, if you look at the real world, there are different ways of having civilizations. There are still people out there, especially in rainforests around the world, whose focus is not about growing. They don't care about GDP, and it's really about balance with nature and making sure that the forest in which they live has enough resources and fruits and roots and so on to sustain the next generations, and they just tend the forest like a big garden and make sure it's going to be there for thousands of years. And they've done this for thousands of years, and it worked until we came there and changed things. How about declining societies and civilizations, like that would be the upper right image. Speaking of Japan, I mentioned before, like the population is now declining. It's actually shrinking as a country. And with our growth, kind of grow, eat kind of mindset, it's terrifying. It's a disaster, if you shrink. But why? Like, shrinking can also be something done elegantly, can be done well. I think it's maybe not the worst thing for the planet if we shrink a bit. And we don't see many games that have that. It's usually about growth, right? Balance, shrinking, also just moving around. That's why I put some pastoralists as well from East Africa. Like, also just the concept of like not owning land, moving around. These are all interesting approaches that we really don't see much in games because we have this dominant kind of capitalistic point of view on things. Who has ever played a game that has a talent tree? Okay, that's a good amount of us. And even like this potentially innocent structure. And by the way, again, like, I love talent trees. We kind of have one in our game as well, so full disclosure. But also, they tend to represent a certain point of view on society. The idea that you keep on getting stronger and growing. And again, that's connected to this sense of like accumulation, growth. It's not just about physical strength, also like mental strength, but it's also about not accepting death. And I'm going to explain why. Because it's very much, in many societies, like non-Western societies, growing old is actually something that people cherish. The elders are respected, you're one step closer to becoming an ancestor. In this Western society, that's very much about growth and strength and so on. Becoming old is something to be ashamed of. Like, you don't want to tell your age because you're scared, like, oh my God, I'm old now. I cannot say I'm almost 40. And also beauty standards. There's an epidemic of like people modifying their body even when they don't feel like, just to keep on appearing young and strong and so on, right? So this is again something that many talent trees embrace. So if you think about it, you don't see very often characters that are just aging, and usually it's kind of like a minus. In many role-playing games, it's like when you start aging, if they have it, like, or tabletop pen and paper games, if you know any, you just start getting minuses. It's like, oh no, my character is dying. But you know, how about wisdom? How about becoming a respected elder? Like, I think that's something we don't see enough. So as I said, yeah, growing old, I think is an interesting topic that somehow is left aside in the society in which we live. Has anyone had issues with hoarding potions in games? Okay, I feel we should start after this talk like a group, just like anonymous, to talk about this and our potion issues. But I think it's also not entirely our fault, actually not at all. And it's really again about hoarding. Like we're told, like we're basically, as kids or in our society and media and everything is all about keeping things, holding things, ownership, our legal system. It's so deep that's hard for us to imagine a system in which ownership and individual property is not the focus of it. And no, I'm not thinking about like Eastern Europe's communism or North Korea. I think there are other societies that did a better job in this. You know, the topic I'm talking about, first of all, is consumerism, of course, which is connected to capitalism, neocolonialism. So it's all part of like one big club of troublemakers in the world. Disclaimer. Also, I'm not saying that everything in our society is bad, you know, and everything is failed, but we have a lot of issues and we should be talking about them and how to improve them, and also putting these improvements in games. But there are societies out there where like property is not something as kind of strictly individualistic as it is in Western societies, in like neo-colonial capitalistic societies. And there's some interesting examples of like hunter-gatherer folks, some in Southern Africa or like in the Amazons, Papua New Guinea. And they have different ways of owning things. And sometimes it's about like who needs what. Okay, you get this because you need it more. About rotating, there's like some etiquette on how you ask things to others. And then once you ask it the right way, you get it. And that's it. And then when that person needs it, they ask it back. So it's unfortunate that we're not living in a planet that experimented more with those ways of sharing things. And I hope that in future we might see like more experimentation in our systems, but we as game developers, we have the power already to try these things in games. So, and I think there's already some games out there that are trying and doing different things around like trying to change these kind of capitalistic perspectives. An example, for example, from our game is that when you go in combat with others, it's usually like some spiritual fights where you're just challenging spirits and learning things. You earn resources, and actually everybody in the fight, even like very weak people or characters who didn't contribute that much to the fight, still get the same rewards. And really wondered for a while, like, people are going to complain about this. We've had 3 alphas, and everybody has been super happy about this. No one has complained like, oh, this person is getting too much. You should reduce what they're getting. So sometimes it's also like a journey of self-discovery, I find, like playing around with these assumptions and then realizing that not all instincts that we expect to have as humans are necessarily real instincts. Sometimes they're like indoctrinations that we got from society, right, from the world in which we are. So yeah, I spoke a bit about mechanics. I think these are some examples, and you can definitely go and think about more things. So I also invite you, like for the jam, you know, whatever mechanic, whatever genre you're thinking of, how can this be imagined a bit differently without necessarily the level of ownership, individualism, competition that you'd have in our modern system. I want to also talk a bit about the content, I'll call it as well. So things that appear like just inside the game. So I spoke a bit about mechanics, but also like just, you know, characters, things that you see into the game. As a kind of disclaimer / opener on this, I want to show a map of the world. And this is the map that most of us use, the mainstream map. And this is actually a Peter's projection of the world, which is much more accurate. This shows like the real sizes of the world. And I think this is really interesting because if you're looking for inspiration for your game, it's like we want to create, I don't know, whatever role-playing game or like a platformer. And we're looking for some visuals and aesthetics and would like to maybe look somewhere else around the world. Like Europe and North America is just a small part of the world. So there's a lot of interesting inspirations you can get from elsewhere. And for instance, Africa, like if you look at this map, you realize how big it is and also how shocking it is that Africans and the diaspora were so little represented in games and media in general, because we're supposed to be massive. Like, we're big, look at us. And this is actually, just to get the point home, like, it's just a very big continent, but also so little represented. And I think this is a very good example of how this neo-colonial capitalistic system has skewed our perception of the world. It's very much the countries, there's some really good, I should have actually added that, like, there's a really good map that shows the world based on GDP, so on actual wealth. And then you see like how Africa shrinks and becomes much smaller, and then Europe becomes super big, and North America is massive, and then you see kind of Japan, and then like other Asian countries become much smaller, and then you realize, oh, that's why like video games are literally about Europe, North America, Japan, and a bit China, and then little else, right? Like there's these economic imbalances also reflected in game development, and I think we can do a better job in representation and changing this. So characters, the people that appear in games, that's a low-hanging fruit. Like this is like a random picture from the internet. As you can see, most characters there are white and also male. So in Anita's talk yesterday, I think it was very interesting. She mentioned that during the average E3, I think she said 3% of protagonists were female, which is shockingly low. I would have expected bad, but not as bad. Same for race, of course, same for queer characters, and so on. This is, I had to look it up just to make sure. So this is like a shocking, but maybe not so shocking fact. White people are like 10% of humanity. Like just, this is this secret I need to reveal. Like, don't tell anyone. I mean, I think we should have white, I'm in favor of representation. Like, we should have white people, we should have white men and everything. So I always say that in my company as well. We're pro-diversity, we want white men in our company, but not necessarily 90% or 100%, right? So I thought even, it's funny that this image I found, like stock image on top, is about the world and there's people around it, but even there I actually calculated, like there's 15 people, and I think like half are white. So that was the idea of the kind of graphic designer of like super diverse world, we have all of the races, is still 50% white. And I think that's a good example. We see it in games a lot. And it's so simple, like just check, like, I mean, not every game has to represent exactly, like humanity. But even if you're thinking about, for instance, the West and US, right? You think, oh, but then in that case, it's kind of normal that the majority of characters would be white. But this is millennials and Gen Z. Millennials 55% white, Gen Z 50% white, right? So it really doesn't work. Like, and these numbers need to be reviewed. So it's very much, I think, time to kind of start thinking, even in the West, so US and Europe, to rebalance out. So when you're making your jam, if you have a bunch of characters, I think it's really worth thinking, why not maybe making 50-50, mixing up a bit things. Yeah, so I think this meme is just funny. It used to go around for a while, but yeah, that's not like the full gamut of human representation. Yeah, so talking about content, I think another interesting one is fantasy. Many games have like sci-fi, fantasy themes. And I want to talk both about fantasy and AI, because I was looking for fantasy images and I got flooded with like this, many of them like cheap-looking AI images. And then I realized, oh wait, let me talk about this as well. So fantasy, a problem that we have is that our imaginary other worlds are very Eurocentric. And I think that's a good exercise to make when you're creating your game, is like fantasy castle. This is like, just input fantasy castle. And the AI is actually reflecting, and I think that's really scary, what we as a collective society on the internet or in the world think. So this is a fantasy castle, but there are so many other types of castles around the world, right? Like that, why are we taking that 10% of humanity historical castles and making that the fantasy for everyone? I mean, we can do Euro fantasy. I think it's great. I love The Lord of the Rings and Euro fantasy, but there's so many other fantasies, right? And we should be careful not to stick only to this. And I think AI is actually entrenching this, because now it's just spewing out more and more based on these biases. And I think we'll have to even fight and be even more creative and create more original content to make sure that we actually represent the beautiful diversity, of cultures and ideas and themes and mechanics that we can have as a humanity. So I think this is very dangerous. It's something to keep in mind. This is a very interesting example I wanted to mention of a pen and paper, actually tabletop RPG that's made by native folks in the US. And it's a fantasy game, I think with some sci-fi elements. And it's completely inspired by native mythologies and people from the US and North America. I think that's really cool. And when I saw it, I was, I need to get this because I want to learn something. So there's so many other interesting cultures and ways to think also about the fantastical, which I think as game developers we should really think about because we're really good at making fantasy and sci-fi. We shouldn't get stuck in the kind of Eurocentric idea because also, and reconnecting the dots, Eurocentrism is obviously a child of colonization and the fact because in the end most colonization was done by Europe and therefore the languages that people speak around the world, I mean English is the dominant language not because the spelling is great, which is not, spoiler, but because of colonialism, right? Like half of the world was literally owned by the United Kingdom, by Britain. So yeah, let's be aware of this. Yeah, this is another one I wanted to mention on content, thinking about your game, some visuals. Maybe your game has, I don't know, it's a platformer set in a forest and you're running around just jumping and doing things. But when I Googled forest, this was the first image that came out. And again, I think this is very interesting because most forests around the world are not necessarily like this. This is like a probably European, if there's any biologist, kind of stop me here, is it European or North American, but definitely European, North American. Often you have in fantasy this kind of mix in which there's a bit of plants from North America and Europe, kind of like European oaks and stuff, like it's a bit of a mix, but it's like, of course, a legacy of this kind of Western domination of the collective imaginary. So I can tell you for us that we're making an Afro-fantasy game, an African-inspired fantasy game. We have struggled so much to find images of trees and plants and so on from Africa, from the rainforest in Congo or in Nigeria. It's just shockingly hard to find content. And that's because the internet has been colonized or kind of is created from this. So actually shows, you'll find like a crazy amount of, I think actually Wikipedia has more information on Paris than it does on the whole of Africa, or something like this. It's just crazy the imbalance that you have of information. So if you're aware of this and you think, oh, we're putting the forest, like does it necessarily have to be like a European forest? Or maybe you can use some trees and plants from India or from some other parts of the world. Yeah, here, there's so many biomes around the world, so sometimes just the background, what you're showing in your game, that can also be decolonized, right? Like just the trees and flowers and plants, if you have any for some reason in your game. Or even the boats, like or the means of transport, or I think animals, yes, I put animals, like also using the wolf as like, I don't know, a scary, aggressive animal that's threatening you. Why not? But then, there's other animals out there that have like very important mythologies and are very present around the world, like the leopard, which is like on 3 continents and has like a lot of tradition mythology. It's also like a beautiful animal. I think we should see more leopards. Like I like wolves, don't get me wrong, but I think we should see more leopards in games as well. So I'm pro wolves and pro leopards. And again, in general, what I mean is also like don't get me wrong, I was actually born in Europe and I love it. I'm half Italian. I think it's an amazing culture and everything. But what I want to say is that we should not default constantly on this kind of Western, Eurocentric, post-colonial, capitalistic perspective, right? So let's always kind of challenge ourselves and go, and I do it sometimes as well. Like I'm like, oh, let's do this, and like, wait, why did I take this for granted? Let me stop and kind of think and kind of brainstorm a bit. So yeah, these were just some examples of like on the castle topic. Like that was like a 5 minutes Google search on like castles or fortifications from other parts of the world. You see like a Japanese castle, then you see a fortress in India, then you see a fortress from Zimbabwe, and they all look so different and interesting. So if I were making a game about, I don't know, a siege game, like about castles, like I'll try maybe mixing up things or like, just experimenting, not just going for the usual default of a Eurocentric castle from those countries that ended up ruling the world. Music. I'm very excited to talk about music because I think music is one of those underrated topics in general in games. I think as a tip, you should think about music ASAP. Is really going to benefit your game. I don't know if there's any music people here, but go if you're there. even the way we understand music in games has been affected by this post-colonial world. Classical music, already the fact that we call it classical, is classical for who? Like for Europe, of course. It's not classical music from China, it's not, like even now in Africa there's a movement among some musicians to start calling traditional music classical African music, because it's so powerful. Like the fact of defining classical only European historical music is very much colonial, right? And also the word tribal, like I rarely use the word tribal, because even growing up I was struggling, is like, wait, so my mom is from a tribe, my dad is just from a nation, but like they're just, I was really confused about it. Like they're just human beings. My dad was also from a village, my mom was from a big city, but no, he was not from a tribe because he was white, and she was from a tribe because it was, but there were skyscrapers in the tribe that she came from. It just didn't make sense for me. So I just, yeah, even the word tribe like is colonial. Like there's just a lot. When you start, you cannot stop anymore. So you should start. I think there was an interesting example I found on the internet. Black Panther, I'm not going to dive into it. It's a great film, though there's some issues. And there was this review of a lady, bless her, like she loved the film, but she complained about the drums. And she was like, there were too many drums, there were drums everywhere, and it got stressful. Even in like nice moments or like quiet moments, there were drums in the background. And I don't know why they did this. And I thought, how interesting. It also got upvoted a lot. And I was like, how interesting this comment, because it shows how also music in our imaginary, for in this case is movies, but also applies for video games, of course, has been colonized. And now we perceive drums only through the lens of like Western classical music. Drums are usually like kind of winter and war and like something very dramatic and terrible is happening. And that's because European tribes used to use drums to kind of fight among each other on the continent. Whereas like in many African cultures, or dare say most, drums are used for kind of everything. For like happy celebrations, for funerals, sad moments, for like political engagement, diplomacy, even to communicate. Like you can use drums actually in some cultures as a way to send like messages across distances, like they're called talking drums. So, but that was hard for this lady to understand, and sadly she couldn't realize that her point of view was biased by this kind of colonial perspective in which the European standard, in this sense, classical music, is everywhere. So even for your game, if you're thinking about the sound effects, the music, maybe try experimenting with some different sounds that you didn't expect. Like, for instance, in our game, we're having when you kind of get defeated and you kind of die before you get resurrected, we're putting in like a death flute, which is played in Ghana and some parts of West Africa, like in funerals. And that's different from what you'd hear in other games. But then we're creating a new association. It's like death flute is death. And it works, it's not confusing, it's kind of new. And we're also helping kind of teach players something different, and make different associations. Yeah, another one is also, and I'm not going to dive too deep into this, is the topic of queerness and how also this kind of is very much, the way we represent queerness or do not represent it in games is also very much affected by these systemic issues of kind of this post-colonial capitalistic world. A very sad, interesting example is King Mwanga II from Buganda in East Africa. He, at the end of the 19th century, fought against missionaries and European colonialists. One of the main reasons was that he wanted to be able to keep lovers, like concubines, of both genders. So he was very upset when they came there, I think it was the Belgians or Germans, and they were like, you should have only women, this is not good. And also, you should give us money and we're going to dominate you. And for some reason, he was especially enraged with the first part. He's like, I want to sleep with whoever I want to sleep, that's our culture. And that shows also like how homophobia is very much, I'm not saying that there isn't patriarchy, there wasn't patriarchy around the world and homophobia didn't exist, but this specific brand, of kind of like two genders and everything is, and you probably know this, but I think it's worth kind of reminding us that it's related to this system of colonialism and domination, and also economic system of capitalism that we have there. And this is affecting our games. And it's not a coincidence that games have struggled with representation of queer folks so much. And look at this. Like more than a century later, Uganda is like actually one of the countries in the world. It just recently passed, unfortunately. So now Uganda has death penalty related to some queer or sodomy offenses or whatever they call them. So it went from like having your own head of state in the 19th century fighting against colonialists to have like basically free love in his own palace to like the parliament voting that penalty for queer folks. So I don't feel safe there anymore. Like I have friends that wanted to go to Uganda. I visited Rwanda last year. I can't anymore. I don't feel safe. So this is real. Like this is still happening. And when we're making games, we can have a little bit of an impact, change things. So we should be constantly fighting against this. It's like a big monster, right? So let's not take things for granted. This, by the way, is a very interesting book that talks specifically about this topic. It's more focused on Africa, but on how also colonialism affected queerness throughout the continent. Yeah, so here, like some other themes, I just threw that, because this talk will be potentially, as you can see, much longer. It's more an introduction to the topic, so you can think about it. But I think what I'm showing here with those icons is like the topic of individualism as well. I think is something that is very, especially US American, from North America, the idea that in many games you see it like you're kind of different from everyone else and you should make it on your own and you're kind of going to fight against like everyone and no one is going to help you. Like sometimes it's true, but I think it's very much like a bias that we have a bit coming from North America. I'm not saying that sometimes you don't have to do things on your own or kind of like fight society, but there is very much a bias towards like against the collective, or like the idea of like of doing things like as a community. Also the fact that we see history now a lot like kings or usually it's men, like people but men doing things, and like also many video games reflect this, like many historical games also is like always the leader making decisions. You very rarely see like you just own, like you're managing a group of people doing something, like and that's something very Western, very kind of post-colonial, capitalistic. And it would be great, like also in games, if we tried a bit more to tone down individualism and sometimes things about making things happen with a group of people, a group of characters, equally contributing. Yeah, so this is just, I thought about a couple of, it was an exercise for me to kind of say, okay, like, Allan, you're going to tell all of those things to a crowd out there. Like, can you make some examples so that it actually makes sense and show how this could be used? So I just did a bit of a mental exercise and thought, like, what could like a couple of games look like? This is not necessarily like super good ideas, but just experiments. So here I was thinking about a strategy game trying to get away from many of the principles that, for instance, civilization has. And I thought, like, how about a game set in a rainforest, maybe like, I don't know, African or Southern American inspired, where it's all about keeping balance with spirits and with nature. So if you grow a bit too much, you have to find ways to go down. If you're going down, you have to find ways to go up. And you have to find a way to please spirits in the forest and make sure that the resources kind of don't get depleted. And you basically win the game if you manage to do this for a certain amount of time and you've kept the balance. So the end of the game, the village looks more or less like at the beginning, and you have done well, clap, clap, because you maintain things in balance and everything is in harmony. Why not? Or the idea, like why not the idea of like a pastoralist somewhere in Central Asia, like maybe some shaman lady, very, very frail old woman, actually sick, like every month she gets weaker and she's forgetting things. And the game is like some simple turn-based combat in which you're kind of, maybe fighting some invaders or something to protect the community, but also constantly losing powers, forgetting things. And it's all about managing the decline of this shaman, keeping everyone safe, and maybe passing away in the end, passing away happily because you know that you've actually protected your community with the little memories, a few spells that you had. Maybe when you get your last spell, that's it. When you forget your last spell, you're gone. That's your last day. So I think, again, these are just examples. I'm not saying it should actually be games, but just like examples of how you can try and think out of the box or out of the post-colonial capitalistic box. Yeah, and this, okay, I did want to just put a cute baby in the picture, in the presentation, but also what I wanted to say is that everything matters. It doesn't have to be the whole game or everything. Like, even just like a tiny, like one variation of a mechanic, or like one event in your game, or like one character, or like one line that is written in the game has been thought like through this process, kind of challenging maybe some of your preconceptions as a team. That's awesome already. That's great. So I think let's be kind with ourselves. This is very difficult. Even I, as a black queer man, I find myself falling into many of these tropes or things. You know, as a cisgender man, I find sometimes myself defaulting to like male characters, and I'm going like, why? Why should I? So, you know, let's not be too hard with ourselves. You know, we're all learning, but even a little step can really help because we're gradually all getting better, you know, and trying to change the system. So, as a summary, you know, when thinking about mechanics for your game, try and kind of ask yourselves how these mechanics reflect the real world and kind of our broken world, and how maybe they could be different. You know, how you could maybe create a variation of this mechanic or completely change the mechanic to experiment with like a different point of view, maybe based on some other culture that's not a typical Western kind of growth-focused, hyper-growth-focused culture. And then for the content, kind of visuals, characters, story, music, just open to other parts of the world. So don't default also on the Western characters or like the white Eurocentric, but how about, you know, the rest of the world and kind of exploring the 90% of everything else. And then themes, basically themes run across everything from mechanics, right, to the story and so on, but also asking yourself, like, how could these themes be different, you know, right? Not just the usual ones that we take for granted, such as hypergrowth or accumulating things or ownership. Maybe there's other things about, you know, managing decline or like, or just staying there, balanced, equilibrium, or like growing old and so on. I'm sure you'll find like even better ones, and I hope if you do send me an email, I'd love to hear that. A couple of tips to end just on research, because I've been asked sometimes like, so where do I find things? I hinted at it before while speaking. So Wikipedia, if you have been to university, you probably know this already. You shouldn't rely on Wikipedia too much. Once you start looking into it, it's really, really biased. Like Wikipedia is good on one hand. I think it's amazing that we have it, and I'm in favor of spreading knowledge for free, but also the people who are making Wikipedia, people who speak the languages on Wikipedia, there is a bias, right? So yeah. Books, therefore, become super important. Like there's been a decline of reading books and researching on books, but I can't understate like how important it is. Like when you're looking for ideas, inspirations, with your jam, you know, maybe there's not enough time, but in general, like when making games, I find it incredibly useful. Like just get a book on like different, I don't know, you're working on a game that's like a racing game, like on different kind of sports and racing cultures around the world, and you might go like, wow, I never thought about this, you know, this could be a new winning condition or something. Language. I think many of you here, like how many of you actually speak other languages that are not English? Awesome. Yeah, so that's great. Lots of, I mean, don't get me wrong, English is nice, but if you speak other languages, that's great because it gives you access to so much hidden information. Like there's so much interesting research that maybe you wouldn't know about. For instance, you know, if you speak Danish, you might access a lot of interesting information on Danish colonialism that people don't talk much about. You don't see it in English a lot. Like my ancestors literally grew up on the shadow of a Danish slave castle. And sometimes some Danes are like, but the Danes were not really. I'm like, literally 500 years, and also have a Danish ancestor from that. So it's like, no. But this is like stuff that often is not always translated in English. A lot of interesting stuff is in Portuguese or in French or, you know, in any other languages. So if you speak another language, that's awesome. Don't forget to use it to do your research because you might find like some interesting different points of view. You know, like let's not stick only to English. Yeah, this is like how you see, again, the bias of Wikipedia and of the internet in general. So that's why it's really good to read books because you have access also to other languages. I found papers in general to be very useful. I used to be terrified by the idea of like downloading papers and reading them, but I realized as a game developer trying to new things, you know, and experiment and open my mind. There's a lot of amazing papers like sociology papers, economics, and even gaming ones, but I like to go even further out and kind of to expand. And you realize that this can really help you sometimes to reset your mind and get some fresh ideas on how the world works and how to bring these into your game. Last but not least, speak with people actually who are different from you, right? So if you have them in your team from a game jam, that's awesome. Try and get them. You should try and avoid maybe having a team of only like 6 white, cis, straight Danish man. I don't know. It would be nice to try. And if unfortunately, that doesn't work out, maybe still like just go to someone who's different from you and just ask them for a couple of ideas. Maybe show them your design and what you're working on and go like, hey, do you have any inputs or could you give us some suggestion? Because that would make them feel appreciated. It's like, oh, finally a space in which I'm welcome, even if I'm a minority. And also will help you to make, have some cool ideas and kind of do all of the things that we spoke about this last 40 minutes. But also if they're busy and they don't have time, don't press them too much. If they have time and they're kind, nice, but otherwise, yeah. So, and I already see like it's a quite lovely, diverse crowd here, so I'm optimistic and I wish you all a lot of good luck for the jam. I hope you make the best games. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, questions. So, has anybody got questions? Okay. Should I microphone or? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm loud. I don't need it.
Okay. Okay.
What advice would you have? I think a lot of people might be nervous about going from appreciating into appropriating or fetishization or something. What would you, in your opinion, be like, hey, if you're here, this is a red flag, stop? In your opinion, what would be your advice there?
Yeah. So the question, say for the camera, on like how to avoid cultural appropriation, fetishization, and to be respectful when engaging with other cultures, for instance, right? Or sexual minorities and so on. So I think it's a great question, thanks. One thing I want to say again is that I find cultural annihilation something that we don't talk about enough. So just I think that we should have like this cloud like hanging behind us. Like it's really terrifying when as humanity we decide to make something disappear, like a whole culture or a whole language, and by the way, half of humanity's languages are disappearing in the next couple of decades, right? So it's like this is happening, like cultures are disappearing all the time. So I think that's terrifying because we're losing ways of thought. Even just the way you speak actually can really change the way you think about things and open your mind. So as you know, as polyglots in this room. So I think it's really important what you're saying, like we should actually try and explore and gather. And I think the most simple thing that one can do is like to speak with someone from that community. So yeah, to drop an email, get in touch in person if you have. And I think just having the initial sanity check is really great. And I find like 90% of the time it helps. And of course, research too. But I really think like you always want to have like a sanity check with someone from that community. And if you're actually professionally working on a game, I think you should also pay that person as a consultation. But if it's like a jam and we're all friendly, then just maybe pass by and ask them. Does that answer the question? Yeah, cool.
You touched upon this with language and English dominating a lot of the conversation. Especially in Danish, a lot of Danish is phased out in favor of English jargon, also in our day-to-day talk. And I find that a lot of cultural context is lost when you have to translate to another language. So how do you, say you have a story from a part of the world that is speaking English, how do you balance keeping that cultural context, but at the same time keeping it accessible so other people can learn from it, and so it doesn't become just for the people that speak that specific language?
Yeah. So basically how to translate without losing cultural, or trying to lose as little cultural context as possible for non-speakers of the language. Great question. I don't think there is one answer, one way to do this. But this is something that, for instance, Africans encounter a lot, because if you think about it, most Africans actually in public spaces like school or work or so on don't speak the native language. Speak like a European language. Usually it's English, French, or Portuguese, or Spanish sometimes, whatever. And so that's something that actually affects, for instance, Africans even more than some other people in other parts of the world. There's no one way to solve this. I feel like this personal take on this would be like not to stop still producing in your own languages. Like I think there's still someone who will either still speak it or want to learn it. Languages sometimes are even brought back from extinction. Like look at Israel, literally dead language, and now they brought back their own language from the grave, right? And So who knows what's going to happen if you keep on producing content also in your language, and it might become, maybe it will shrink further, maybe it will become bigger in future. And who knows like what in 500 years languages will look like. Maybe we'll have like just people will be learning all sorts of languages and we'll be splitting in communities around the world, learning 2 or 3 languages, and then like your game in Danish that you made 500 years ago will be played by like people down there, and they'll be like, this historical game is super cool. So it's a tricky balance. Personally, I do both. I try to do a bit in English and also in my native language, and that would be my recommendation, to kind of keep both alive. But it's hard. It's not easy. Is there a question there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last one.
Okay.
Sorry, I was just I opened the microphone. Try to hear. So you're working on Wakadu Chronicle or
Chronicles.
Chronicle. That's wrong.
No, it's that the S couldn't fit on Twitter, so we had to remove. That's it. It's just Twitter's fault.
So I was curious. You obviously got a lot of good propositions, let's say. But I'm sure that in making the game must have made some compromise, maybe to cope with what gamers expect. Is there any kind of thing that you can remember or can you talk about?
So great question about compromises made in our game, the Wakadu Chronicles, between like kind of our pure non-colonial post-relational like vision versus like the commercial Western Eurocentric, right, like reality of facts. Great question, and I think my answer is that we don't have actually such a strict distinction. Like we don't have this ideal like this is like the perfect, I don't know, black queer thing, like away from everything, just because we understand that everything is mixed, like and it's a spectrum. Also, the concept of like conquering, invasion, like or like even slavery. Like yes, it was perfected by Europeans, but it existed across cultures, right? So, or patriarchy, like there's in different ways, but patriarchy existed also in pre-colonial Africa, for instance. It's not in different ways, and often like women still had their own roles separate. Like for instance, in Ghana, historically, women were business women. Were business folks, but also like politically it was more like a male thing, like although they also had queen mothers that had their own separate role. So it's always complicated. So how we deal with it is more like what we think like works for us, that makes us comfortable. And I find that we haven't had to do like major compromises because it's more being quite organic. And I think one of the biggest challenges maybe is more around monetization, like how to make sure that what we do, that we can pay our bills, with what we do. But I think that's a challenge that also most game developers have. But around the cultural kind of vision, maybe to kind of add to that point, I can say that we also acknowledge that we're a diaspora inspired game. Like most of us were not born in Africa, like the black folks in the team, we're not only black. And therefore, like there's already embedded a lot of like Western idea. Like even our concept of fantasy, it is yes African inspired, but also has a lot of influences from Tolkien, from like other fantasy writers or games or movies and so on. So, but we think that's beautiful. Like everything is a conversation and kind of moves a step forward. I'm sure in future there'll be like some games that are going to be like even more queer and like we do have, for instance, like some economic competition in our game, and I'd love to see future games that don't have this at all. And it's literally just like some raging communist black trans gay game, and and we're not that game. Where some parts of it are, but yeah. But yeah, thanks for the question, and I think it's a spectrum, and we're happy where we are, but we hope to see even more people doing more. With questions, are we done? Is there?
I think we have to finish.
Okay, then thanks everyone. Thank you.